Welcome to The Explainer. So, today we're decoding a pretty fascinating one-page framework, one that actually bridges a really ancient narrative with modern-day resilience. We're essentially looking at a highly structured guide for spiritual obedience when we're facing our absolutely most difficult struggles. Let's just jump right in.
Now, here's a question that hits all of us at some point. What do you do when your resources completely run out? Honestly, whether it's your patience, your money, your health, or just your hope, hitting the absolute bottom of the barrel, well, it's a universal crisis we all have to navigate. And when the well runs dry, that's usually when the panic sets in. But what if there was an actual blueprint for exactly how to handle that precise moment of depletion?
Let's dive into this. We're unpacking a specific matrix today that literally translates the famous biblical story of Jesus turning water into wine into a step-by-step, actionable blueprint for personal faith. As you'll see, the source document elegantly maps the story on one side, what historically happened, directly to what God expects from us on the other side, which is the modern application. It's just a brilliant way to turn a historical narrative into a really practical toolkit.
All right, moving to section 1, the celebration and the crisis. Let's look at the setup of the problem.
So the framework kicks off with this sort of dual-track narrative. On the left side, the ancient story begins with a really simple act, attending a wedding, just a completely regular life event. But on the right side, the document tells us that this directly mirrors the modern expectation to invite Jesus into our ordinary daily life. Basically, the foundation for handling hard times is actually laid during the good times. Now, what's really interesting here is the shift. The crisis hits when the wine runs out. In the ancient context, this was a massive social disaster. For us, it's a perfect metaphor for our own resources running dry. The Matrix uses this exact moment to illustrate a critical pivot. Mary noticed the need, and she told Jesus. So the modern translation of that, we have to notice the needs in our own lives and immediately bring them to God. According to this framework, the very first step in managing a crisis isn't to panic, right? It isn't to furiously try and fix it yourself or, hide the fact that you're running on empty. The step is actually to observe the depletion clearly and then redirect the problem upward. You acknowledge the reality of those empty jars, and you completely hand over the stress of the situation to a higher power. Okay, section 2, trusting the timeline. This is all about waiting for resolution. In the story, there's a bit of friction here. Jesus mentions his timing, specifically, that his time has not yet come, but Mary simply turns to the servants and tells them to do whatever he says. The document explicitly decodes this interaction as the practical challenge of waiting for God's timeline. We've all been there, right? It's that highly uncomfortable gap between asking for help and actually receiving it. The absolutely crucial point is this. During a crisis, true obedience means trusting a higher authority when your personal, desired timeline for a fix just doesn't match up with reality. Look, we usually want instant relief, but this blueprint requires patience and really submission to a schedule that just isn't our own. Moving right along to section 3, taking action in faith. This is where we get into doing the hard work. So the ancient narrative tells us that Jesus ordered 6 large stone jars to be filled with water. And the servants didn't just put a little splash in, they filled them all the way to the brim. Then, remarkably, they took a cup of that water and served it to the master of the banquet before it ever actually changed into wine. I mean, just think about the sheer awkwardness of that moment for those servants. Which brings up a highly challenging application for anyone going through a hard time. Are you willing to do the hard work and act on faith before you have any tangible evidence that things will improve? I mean, would you carry a cup of plain water to your boss, hoping it magically transforms on the way? This brilliantly illustrates how the text maps these specific servant actions to 2 core expectations for us today. First, you look at your current resources, which, let's be honest, might just be ordinary water, and you give your best effort. You literally fill the jars to the brim. Second, you take action in faith before the final result is visible. You serve it. You step right out into the unknown, relying solely on trust. Even when your resources feel entirely inadequate, like having plain water when you desperately need wine to save the day, the framework suggests utilizing whatever effort you currently have available to the absolute brim. You see, you don't get a pass on doing the work just because you're waiting on a miracle. You literally have to bring your absolute best to the table with whatever you happen to have left. And that brings us to section 4, the final blessing, the ultimate payoff.
The ancient story concludes with a miraculous transformation. The water didn't just become wine, it became the absolute finest wine at the party. And, as a result, his disciples believed in him. This perfectly mirrors the modern expectation to ultimately trust God to provide the final resolution, bringing the crisis to a close in a way that completely surpasses expectations.
Now, the document highlights an incredibly profound point right here. The ultimate goal of receiving these provisions isn't merely relief from the hard times. Yes, getting the wine saved the wedding, for sure. But the deeper purpose is actively using those new blessings to cultivate deeper belief. The hard time itself was literally a vehicle for growing faith.
Looking at the complete, decoded matrix here, we can really see how every single beat of this ancient event operates as a cohesive, step-by-step strategy for spiritual resilience. It moves flawlessly from normal life into a sudden crisis, through a period of waiting, into active effort, and finally into an abundant resolution and faith building. It's just a complete cycle.
In this explainer, we've seen how looking closely at a source text can reveal a highly structured guide for personal obedience during our most difficult struggles. It really proves that these ancient narratives aren't just dry historical accounts. When mapped out, they offer incredibly relevant psychological and spiritual blueprints for modern survival.
As we wrap up this framework, I really want you to consider this in your own life right now. What ordinary resources or efforts are you being asked to offer up today, trusting the outcome even before the miracle actually happens? Remember, you got to fill those jars to the brim with water first. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I will catch you on the next one.